This is Dr. Ruth Pilkington. I am a freelance education consultant, and you're listening to the Academy's Developing Practice podcast.
Oh, Ruth, it's wonderful that you've come to talk to us today. I particularly am really pleased that you're here. In terms of, I've got to know you over the last few years. You were a professorial fellow at my previous institution, and I have to say, getting to know you and your passion for learning and teaching has been really inspirational to me. Also, just the way that you've mentored me and helped me to think about my practice. I've really appreciated that over the years. So I'm really excited about today and this conversation. But before we get into that, and before we get into your experience to do with specifically learning and teaching, it would be great just to hear a little bit about your background and how you've got to the stage that you're at the moment.
Thank you, Alex. It's lovely to be here, and it's been a privilege to work with you over the past few years and to be here today. So yeah, right. Where did I start? I originally started in the compulsory sector and transferred into higher education way back in time, just before polytechnics became universities, so that's how old I am. And I originally started off as a business linguist, business Russian, business German were my subjects. And then I got involved in national projects because, of course, obviously at that time things were very different to how they are now. A lot of money sloshing around in the system. Mm-hmm. And I led 2 national projects in transferable skills development and employability, both of which have led to multiple publications. And when I returned to the institution after working in that capacity, I was asked to lead a PG cert in learning and teaching for the institution. And from there, I never stopped, because it became PG Cert, Masters in Education. I designed that, and I also designed a professional doctorate for education members of staff, as in anybody interested in developing their educational understanding for the HE or post-compulsory sector. And it's just snowballed into developing a whole range of culture change initiatives around pedagogy, around research forums, building up the higher education understanding and confidence of staff, around their work with students, around themselves as professional learners. And when I left that institution, I joined the HE Academy, now Advanced HE, worked with them for a couple of years developing their CPD activities, and also resources for senior fellowship and principal fellowship, which gave me access to a phenomenal number of colleagues. And from then, I've really been working in professorial capacities and also as an education consultant. So that's me.
So lots of experience there. Reflecting back on all those kind of experiences, what has really fostered that passion for learning and teaching?
I suppose it starts off with yourself, really, and it's I suppose a constant dissatisfaction with how you are and how things are working with the students or with whoever you're working with in learning terms. And a desire to do your very best, which we all share in education, I think. And that desire to help people see the brilliance and the excitement of the subject from our perspective. It's feeding a hunger, and that drives a lot.
So back in 2014, you were awarded the National Teaching Fellowship. Can you just tell us a little bit about the work that you were recognised for?
Yeah, it was for a number of different things. One of them was, of course, my work in professional learning for academics, the development of programs that were formal learning vehicles alongside informal learning vehicles like groups, communities, networks. So programs as well as networks as a mechanism for institutional change. So that was one of the areas. The other area was something that was founded in a rather sick interest I have, which is about assessment. I love assessment.
Okay.
And assessment as a driver of learning. Because let's face it, students walk into a classroom, what have we got to do for this? You know, everybody asks it, what we got to do? So I developed very early on an interest in using assessment as a vehicle for supporting the learning of my students, as well as focusing their attention. And I developed that when I started running my professional learning programs around dialogue.
Right.
Because as a linguist, I know the value of dialogue.
Yeah.
And I know the value of dialogue in terms of communicating ideas and concepts and co-constructing understandings between self and the other. And I also found that there was opportunities for bringing the oral assessment that I was so familiar with in dialogue, role plays, presentations, that sort of thing, case studies done orally, group work, into the professional learning environment, into the HE environment. And so I developed that as a mechanism for professional learning within the PG Cert, within the Masters, and also around Viva development and helping support members of staff as they were doing their doctoral work, and in supervision, because of course within supervision dialogue is central to helping members of staff or learners, the PhD students or doctoral students of whatever ilk, articulate the ideas that they're working with and the knowledge they're trying to generate around their research. So I use dialogue a lot around those programs, and I developed it as a mechanism for awarding fellowship and membership of the Advanced HE UK PSF. So these were the things that I was recognised for in getting my National Teaching Fellowship, and they're areas that I've developed ever since.
So just in terms of what you were saying about assessment, that was one of the conversations that we had probably about 3 years ago. That, well, we've had lots of conversations that have blown my mind, and I probably should have thought about this as an academic before 3 years ago, but that idea of assessment being an extension of learning rather than just an evidencing of knowledge. And you're right, the majority of my students used to walk in and go, okay, what do I need to do to pass this module or this piece of coursework? And actually it's transitioning the discussion around that of actually how can we extend learning through assessment rather than just evidencing knowledge. That, I think that's so interesting. Do you want to unpack a little bit of your thinking around that?
Well, I think the thing that fascinates me about assessment is often we focus on the product. On the product as the articulation of learning. But actually, assessment incorporates both an opportunity to use assessment around the process, and the real learning that we want our students to do is learning that happens in the process of what they do, in the process of doing the assessment or of building towards the assessment and of going out and doing a bit of research or study or having a conversation with their colleagues around a topic and reconceptualising things. So one of the key areas that I found interesting around assessment, which fueled a lot of my work in the national projects and also when I was working in professional and as I work in professional learning, is this idea of bringing out the process elements of learning through the assessed mechanism.
Great.
So that's why, for me, dialogue within the context of fellowship is a valuable approach to take, because it allows you to explore practice in the moment and around the actual topic in a far more potent way. And in capturing those ideas and that thinking, you help people move their own practice forward and their own understanding of where they are in respect of their practice.
Brilliant.
One of the things that you mentioned there was around the informal learning. And I'm particularly keen, from an OD perspective, for people to be able to tell their stories within an institution like this. So what I'm really keen on is trying to get some of that sort of tribal knowledge that we have across the university out and shared, instead of it all being siloed and sort of protected. So what sort of things did you do in terms of the informal learning?
Well, informal learning is, as it implies, informal. It's the learning, and there's also, of course, non-formal learning, which is even more ad hoc. So, I mean, this type of learning sits at that end of the continuum for learning types, where things happen in an exchange with a colleague, about a topic, about a subject, about an area of their practice, about a problem that they're having in practice, or hearing about what somebody else does and taking that and adapting it. And to some extent it's quite difficult to capture, because it remains almost, as it were, in the creation of it, and is carried away by the participants of that conversation, and not really captured. One of the things that I have done, which has worked with individuals and in supervision, is to actually record my conversations with students.
Right, okay.
So if you're doing a supervision, you say to the student, I'm perfectly happy for you to record this, so long as there is an understanding and an agreement that you will not use this for any other purpose than your own reflection, and etc. Because there is a plagiarism issue here, and there is an exposure issue which we've got to be aware of and sensitive of for academics in this day and age. And to date, touch wood, this has never been abused. But if you think about it, and I'm sure this will happen in this conversation, as we're having that exchange, we will all articulate things that are spot on. And then if you say, could you say that again? Or could you repeat that? Gone. Because it's been created in the moment.
Yeah.
So for exchange, that's capturing that exchange with a recording is invaluable to a student, to a member of staff in their sort of mentored situation, or in a supervision situation. What you can do, I suppose, is capture the crucial ideas. And I'm a great supporter of mapping, mind mapping, spider diagrams, and I do a lot of visualising.
Yeah, I love a spider diagram.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the whole value of these things.
Yeah.
I mean, they can be done really, really quickly, and as you're talking, as you're conversing, you just map out the ideas, or you map out the ideas briefly afterwards, or you do a reflective log or a blog. I mean, blog is a really powerful tool of just capturing that summarised exchange in a moment and passing it out there. So I suppose if you're doing informal learnings, depending upon the situation, depending upon the context, there are ways that you can do that. Meeting conclusions, a summary of a meeting, i.e. the action points. For the people who were in that meeting, useful, they can reiterate and pick up. Or short reflective logs or blogs or recordings or mind maps. Or even, as some academic developers do, when they're having workshops and conversations, they put out tablecloths and people start writing on them, you know?
Yeah.
And why not ask your student? One of the things I used to do an awful lot when I was teaching students was actually as we were having the conversation as a class, because I had conversations with the class, was to actually map out on the whiteboard, as we were talking, the key ideas that were coming out of the students. And how easy is it to then take a photograph of that these days?
Yeah.
And you've got it. And then writing it up in your own words, it's your work.
Yeah. I think the difficult thing for us here is those things are happening. Whether they're being recorded or not, I wouldn't be so sure, but it's facilitating it so it can happen more, and it can happen across the boundaries of buildings that we have, and getting those people who are doing amazing things in one area to get that knowledge from them, and then to give that to an area where they would never normally talk because there's no crossovers. So I think that I see that as a fundamental part of my role, to try and reduce the friction, the barriers to cross collaboration.
I think part of that requires a lot of work to build trust.
Yeah, definitely.
And because let's face it, academics are very sensitive to their own ideas, and sometimes that does engender an approach that is about, once I close that door on the classroom or on my work or on my research, it's mine. And a sort of insecurity, I think, which does influence things like peer observation, peer review, or any sort of exchange of ideas, and certainly collaborating over materials and resources, to trust that actually this side of practice, the side of practice which is about the processes of learning, they will only be enhanced by new ideas, by new understandings, by seeing the point of view of the other. We're not yet, and learning is such a difficult thing. It's not something that can be grasped and absolute and declarative in articulating how we influence what is taken away from whatever we do with our students. And so I think in accepting that, we must accept that actually we can only benefit ourselves by talking in and around the practices that we're engaged in, and trying to work with colleagues, learn from colleagues, do co-teach, peer observe, open up the classroom, open up the learning processes that we engage in as individuals, to critique, to interrogation, to sharing and exchange and enhancement, in order to improve what we're doing. There isn't the body of understanding that we can go to and say, that will help me do that better yet.
I think there's a really nice phrase that you used in there in terms of understanding the point of view of the other, and our practice is never enhanced until we understand the point of view of the other. And one of the key things that I learned from you, Ruth, is to listen, which some of us struggle with doing. I'm not just looking at myself, but I am. And I found with working with you, you have a real way of encouraging colleagues to reflect by actively listening to them. Can you tell us a bit about your understanding of the value of listening to the point of view of the other?
Well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, if you accept that the dialogic exchange has a value, and if you accept that one of the things that for us to do is to really enable the other to engage intellectually, critically, with ideas, be it about their own practice and how they go about doing it, or the problems or the knowledge that they have about that practice, and interrogating and reflecting on it and unpacking it so they can articulate it. or even with students as they're trying to grasp a subject idea. And I suppose it's founded in ideas such as, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and, that experienced other and so on and so forth. The role then becomes helping that other really start to articulate what is the crux of whatever they want to explore or the thing that they're talking about. And part of that revolves around the questions that you ask, and part of it requires that you actually do listen and you do respect the other's person and the ideas that they're articulating, and really focus on what they're saying. And one of the things that certainly in my current work, which involves a lot of mindfulness and health and well-being for academics and people working in the HE sector, because it's really difficult now, it revolves around listening, and as a person supporting another, being able to move from your perspective to try and engage with their perspective and their point of view, and then move back to you and then out again, so that you're bringing the two together in your understanding of what is going on. And that can only happen in the quiet spaces.
Yeah, and those quiet spaces, I've always found you're not scared of silence. In lots of our conversations, there's silence, and that I'm really praying that you'll give me the answer, and you never do. So you use silence as well, don't you, to support colleagues in terms of their reflections and encouraging colleagues to articulate their kind of thought processes.
Well, I suppose I wish I could do this with my my son. But part of the thing is, telling people it's not helpful mostly. They've got to come to it from themselves. And so that opportunity to really listen and hear what they're saying and involve them in with your body language, because that's a huge component in our exchanges and our relationships with others. It's an important element and involves that listening. And I'm not actually just listening. I'm not being passive in these exchanges. I'm actually being quite active, and hopefully I'm sort of twitching away, and eye movements and nodding. So there is communication going on, but it's communication that is encouraging and maybe at times just sort of saying,
There was a lot of that in our conversations. You might want to think about that, Alex.
Well, there's a lot of power in silence. Nancy Klein does wrote that book on something similar around those coaching techniques. I don't know if you've come across that.
Of course I have,
yeah,
yes.
Great. So, I mean, there is an awful lot of power in that, allowing that person to think without stepping in and filling the void. A lot of your work focuses on reflection and supporting colleagues to reflect. Can you tell us a little bit about why you think that's important, or do you think it's as important or more important than the listening, or where are you on that?
Well, they all sit as part and parcel of the whole process, I think. Reflection. For me, I suppose the reflection sits at the heart of what it is to be a professional and how we learn. And I think as professional actors in our practice situation, a lot of what we value in our learning is driven by the needs of our, let's say, clients, because it involves all sorts of professionals. The challenges of the practice situation, the issues or the concerns that we have that emerge in our practicing of it. And I think reflection offers an invaluable approach to learning that allows us to explore our practice, encourages us because of the requirements of reflection, which, they require you to look at your practice, step back from it and interrogate it. You can only interrogate it if you have different perspectives or things to sort of say, what should be happening there, or what does it say elsewhere, or what is the wider body of knowledge understanding on this, and come at it with a critical perspective. And whilst people do talk about self-reflection, that can be a bit closed. And I think, therefore, the sooner you bring in the other, and the other can be literature, the body of research, the body of knowledge, or different perspectives on the practice setting, or different perspectives of the players within the practice setting, equally valid, to engage with whatever issue is being reflected upon, the better, because then you can start to assess and evaluate and examine and make judgments about and say, okay, so that's possibly the way forward with that, or that's the next step.
Do you think reflection's a skill to be mastered?
Yeah.
It's something that I didn't think about much over the last, decade of probably my professional career. And then over the last 3 or 4 years, I've adopted a practice where I read something, and I used to read a lot of books and get through them, and I'm like, I've read that, and then somebody would ask me a question and I can't remember what's in the book. But these days I'm reading something and I'll put it down, and then I'll just sit and think about what that's just said. And I'll regurgitate it in my own mind, and then imagine myself having that conversation around what I've just read with somebody else.
Mm-hmm. That's an approach to, and that's perfectly valid. It works for you, and it's a way of having that internal dialogue with the content that you've just engaged with. There are all sorts of different ways of reflecting, and I think one of the challenges for us in organisations as complex and as vast as this, or as any HE institution, is to create spaces within the systems and the processes of practice and the way we work as organisations, the way things are done, that allow us to reflect. And in your stories and capturing those sorts of exchanges, to provide stimuli that will allow people to engage and reflect. That's your challenge, not mine.
Thanks.
She's good at that. Setting you up with challenges. So lots of what your work involves is around professional dialogue, which is really, really interesting. And you've specifically used dialogue as a means of assessing and recognising the professional learning of academics. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it started off way back, as I said, in my original role, when I was assessing one of the modules to try and help members of staff who were doing one of the preliminary modules actually reflect on their own learning in the context of, at that time it was the Institute for Learning and Teaching. That's how long ago it was. And the sort of statements that they had very early on. So of course, to encourage them to engage with their practice and to interrogate it and think about what they were going to do next. And so we used to use little professional dialogues where they would each help, where we would have two participants support each other to talk and to explore their own practice. So all we would do as assessors would be to sit in, record it, so that it could be audited for accountability purposes and quality assurance and moderation indeed, but to allow them to do that supporting and responding, and between the two of them to each achieve the outcomes. Because I suppose one of the things is, and this comes out from work by Rust and O'Donnelly, is that fantastic diagram about how you help students learn about assessment and what they've got to do for assessment. And part of it is getting them to actually sort of look at the assessment and to really understand the criteria from their perspective. So if you're doing a dialogue and you're supporting each other to assess each other, then they're really having to understand the learning outcomes. And that critical eye shifts the game a bit, because it shifts it from me telling them what they've got to produce to them working it out for themselves.
Sure.
And that's what we want students to do, really, in the end. And it's certainly what we want professionals to be able to do, and to have the confidence to apply their own agency to. And so within the context of fellowship, and I'm sure I'm wandering off the piste here, but within the context of fellowship, we have values crucial to any professional body accreditation or recognition. We have subject knowledge, which is about both the subject and about how we teach and how students learn the subject. And then there are the actual activities that we do around the teaching and the delivery of the subject. So engaging our colleagues with those statements in dialogue gets them to understand them for themselves and to start to talk, well, what is a community of practice in your classroom?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? How do you support it? How do you know students are learning at the right level? Well, they have to know about X before they can even start with Y. You know, and then you get them to unpack it. So it's a more powerful way of really getting people to think and unpack what they know and understand, which at the moment, when they go into fellowship or when they teach normally, it's all very tacit. It's all very sort of subliminal and part of what you do. But what you're doing is you're forcing them to really articulate it, and in the articulation they start to say, oh, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess in terms of inclusive practice, supporting colleagues to have dialogue rather than us all regurgitating out those essays or, you know, portfolios, it's another nice means of inclusive practice.
Yeah. And it helps a lot with students who have things like dyslexia or dyspraxia, because they find it difficult to work on the written page. But if they can articulate what they want to think about, and if they've recorded it, then by golly, they can start to work with it a lot more comfortably.
And this has been adopted by a number of institutions for their CPD frameworks. Can you tell us a little bit about how different institutions have adopted it?
Well, when I last did a CPD, a review of the accredited institutions for the for Advanced HE, it was about 40% of institutions were using dialogue.
Oh, interesting.
For assessment purposes.
Yeah.
But when you actually examined the things that they were reporting on what they did in and around fellowship, you found that actually it was well above 90% who had some dialogic component within the systems and processes of how they helped people engage with fellowship at whatever level. So the assessed processes would include dialogue, with or without some sort of backup material like portfolios or a web page or some sort of summary documentation like we have with Ultra. Some would have presentations, some would have a mixture of a presentation and a conversation. Some would allow podcasts so that they would be including some of those members of staff to use alternative mechanisms. So I think those are the pretty much the main forms of presentation, forms of oral exchange, and use of different media and different media for delivery, like recordings or Skype conversations or presentations recorded, or even blogs and things like that. So yeah, those seem to be the main forms of dialogue, and I suppose it's the peripherals that shift how they actually operate, because some of them require a lot more reliance on the writing before you get the dialogue. Some do it all on the dialogue space, and of course the different mechanisms require different approaches and different ways of assessing and making the judgment. And I suppose part of the issue with institutions that go more for a lot more that's written evidence is, I suppose, a little bit of sensitivity about how much confidence they have in the dialogic process, because it's not easy to run a dialogue as an assessed activity. But once you start to do it and you use it and you gain experience in it, they're powerful mechanisms.
More powerful than written?
At least equally, but for professional learning for this sort of thing, I would say, more powerful when done well.
Yeah. So, just moving on a little, some of your work indicates an active professionalism in HE. What does that mean? And then after that, why is that important?
So active professionalism. Well, I think part of it is about being aware of or thinking through what it means to be a professional. And some of the words that are linked with professionalism are service to the client, and values, and accountability, and decision making, and ownership of the decision making, and ideas of enhancement of what you do in terms of your practice. And I mean, surely just those words must be resonating with
Absolutely.
You to say,
improvement.
well, these are all the things that we're expected to do. So I suppose what I mean by active is that actually we as professionals individually have to accept that professionalism is ours. And so we have to be active and proactive in the development of it, because developing our professionalism as educators, as professionals within the HE environment, in whatever environment it is a value that we subscribe to, because of the very nature of professionalism. And let's face it, organisations often won't do it for us.
No, very true.
And one of the things I talk about a lot with colleagues is the notion of professional capital. And really it's down to us as individuals to think about what is our personal professional capital, our worth to the organisation, our worth for us, and how we develop it, because even in the most wonderful appraisal situation or annual review of what we're doing with our line managers, I'm sure all of us will find that in the end they're saying, so what do you want to do to develop yourself? Because it's down to you to do it.
Yeah, and it comes back to that first thing you said around accountability. It was the very first word you said, wasn't it?
Yeah. So active professionalism is about accepting that notion of professional capital, engaging with it and developing ourselves towards it, and making those decisions for ourselves. And some of those decisions may be work-life balance.
Great, thanks Ruth. There's been some really interesting and thought-provoking discussion there, so thank you for that. We like to finish each podcast with 3 or 4 kind of take-home tips for the listeners to help them to kind of reflect on in terms of their own personal practice. So if you could give us some some hints or tips in terms of things that we could go away to reflect on, what would they be?
Okay, well, I think one of them is something that we've not really referred to, which I think relates to the complexity and the challenges of the environment we're in at the moment, which is to think of your own health and well-being and planning activities and space to support yourself, because it is hard. I suppose another one would be in respect of dialogue, and that's be proactive and creative yourselves in creating spaces for dialogue and reflection with your students and with each other, because it is worth it. And you'll gain invaluable learning from it. And I suppose if you're doing fellowship, one of the temptations is to regard it as a tick box, get it done. I would say maybe in the context of what we've been talking about today, to actually use it as an opportunity to create space for yourself, to explore your own professional identity and to reflect on what you do in your practice. And maybe aligned with that, maybe think about your own professional capital and how you go forward from it. I suppose the fifth one would have to be listen. There you go.
Brilliant.
That's it.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for coming in. Thanks for chatting with us.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. It's been great.
It's been a pleasure. Always is.
So it was great to hear from Ruth there. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I know you did, Alex, from your face as we were going through it. Some of the things that I'd like to just pick out there when she was talking about informal learning and how that happens in an exchange between colleagues, and therefore often that's sort of carried away in the moment and not captured. So sort of if you can create an open environment where conversations can be recorded or even mind mapped with spider diagrams, that can be an incredibly powerful way to reflect on those moments where ideas are made or shared. And I suppose another thing, and there was so much good content in that conversation. Another thing was when Ruth was talking about the power of using silence to encourage colleagues to come to their own conclusions, and that being a much more effective way rather than simply telling them what to do.
Yeah, that's something that I've definitely been challenged by again through that conversation, is that power of listening to support colleagues to reflect. And the role of the experienced other with a view to supporting development. That's something that I'm going to think more about over the next couple of weeks. For me, the passion that Ruth shows through the things that she says and the things that she does for learning and teaching is really inspiring. And I love what she said about how her passion has come from a constant desire to help people see the brilliance of their subject. There was loads of good stuff in that discussion today that we can think about and reflect on further. If you'd like to take your thinking further, then please do visit the website. That's liverpool.ac.uk/the-academy/podcast. And if you click on the link for this specific podcast, there'll be a whole range of different resources there that you can follow up in terms of reading, research, and various articles that you might want to have a look at. Also, do let us know what you thought of our conversation with Ruth today. We'd love to hear your feedback on Twitter. That's @LiveUniAcademy. We'd love to hear back from you.
Yeah, and if you can please rate and review in Apple Podcasts, or simply subscribe to the podcast in platforms such as Spotify, Google Podcasts, or even YouTube, that'll be great. Thanks very much. Bye for now.